My name is Alana, and I was 18 years old when I woke up in the intensive care unit with a collapsed lung. Instead of rushing to comfort me, my mother stayed at her exclusive beach resort, furious that my car accident was interrupting her sorority mixer. What she did not know was that her twisted priorities would lead my grandmother to hand me a secret letter from my late father, a letter that would give me the power to dismantle her high society empire. Before I tell you how a single piece of paper changed my life forever, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your peace. You will want to stick around to hear how I turned the tables on the woman who cared more about her country club status than her own daughter. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the first sound that registered as I drifted back to consciousness. Every breath felt like broken glass settling inside my chest. I tried to move my arms, but sharp pain pinned me to the sterile hospital bed. Blinking against the harsh fluorescent lights, I turned my head just enough to see my grandmother Estelle sitting beside me. Her eyes were red and swollen, carrying the heavy weight of someone who had not slept in days. She held my hand tightly, offering the only comfort in that freezing room. I had been in a terrible car crash just days shy of my 19th birthday. The impact crushed the driver's side door and left me with a collapsed lung that required emergency surgery to save my life. As my grandmother gently stroked my hair, the heavy wooden door suddenly flew open. My mother Yvonne marched inside, bringing a gust of cold air and the overwhelming scent of her expensive perfume. I expected to see fear or relief on her face. I expected her to rush to my bedside. Instead, she stood at the foot of my bed, looking entirely out of place in her brightly colored designer resort wear and oversized sunglasses. She did not ask how I was feeling. Her perfectly manicured hands were clenched as she glared at my grandmother. The doctors actually made me fly all the way back from Martha's Vineyard just for some ridiculous paperwork, my mother yelled, her voice echoing loudly off the hospital walls. I am supposed to be hosting the regional sorority mixer this weekend. Do you have any idea how important this event is for my standing? I have women from prominent families in Atlanta waiting for me, and I am stuck here because of her carelessness. I lay there paralyzed by the sheer cruelty of her words. My own mother viewed my near-death experience as nothing more than an inconvenient scheduling conflict that threatened her flawless social image. Growing up in a wealthy African-American household meant that excellence and public perception were prioritized above everything. My mother was obsessed with projecting the ultimate picture of success to her church congregation and elite social circles. A daughter fighting for her life in the intensive care unit did not fit into her curated narrative of perfection. Before I could process the sting of her rejection, my grandmother stood up from her chair. Estelle was a woman of profound grace and immense patience, but I had never seen such a dark storm brewing in her eyes. She walked directly up to my mother and slapped her across the face. The sharp crack of the impact silenced the entire room, leaving only the steady beep of my heart monitor. "You spoiled, selfish child," my grandmother said, her voice shaking with terrifying rage. "Your daughter was bleeding out on a stretcher, and the hospital could not legally operate without a parent giving consent. They called begging you to authorize the procedure over the phone, and you told them you were too busy entertaining your rich friends to deal with hospital forms. You simply left her here to die." My mother held her stinging cheek, her eyes wide with shock. "I knew she would be fine," she stammered, trying to regain her composure. "I was going to sign the papers on Monday." I drove straight through the night from Atlanta. My grandmother continued ignoring her excuses. I went directly to a judge at 3 in the morning and filed for emergency medical proxy. "I stripped you of your parental rights to make medical decisions for Alana because you are unfit to be a mother. The surgery is already done, and you have no power here." My mother's face twisted with pure fury at the realization that she had been legally bypassed. Her precious authority and control had been snatched away by her own mother. "You had no right to do that," she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at my grandmother. "I am going to call my own lawyers right now and have this hospital sued for letting you bypass my authority." My mother spun around and stormed out of the intensive care unit, letting the heavy door slam shut behind her. The room plunged back into silence. My grandmother let out a long, trembling sigh and walked over to lock the door, securing the deadbolt with a soft click. She returned to my bedside and reached into her leather purse. Her hands were shaking as she pulled out a worn manila envelope that looked like it had been hidden away for a very long time. She leaned down close to my ear, her eyes darting nervously toward the locked door. "Your mother only cares about the money and the status your father left behind," my grandmother whispered, placing the envelope directly onto my chest. "Your father knew exactly what she was capable of, and he left this for you before he passed away 2 months ago. You need to read it fast before she comes back with her attorneys." I stared down at the envelope, recognizing my father's familiar handwriting across the front. I had no idea what was inside, but my heart pounded against my ribs, telling me that whatever secrets this paper held would give me the exact weapon I needed to fight back and reclaim my stolen life from her forever. My fingers trembled as I tore open the heavy paper of the envelope. The hospital room was completely silent, except for the rhythmic thumping of my heart monitor. But the words on the page screamed at me in my father's familiar, sprawling handwriting. "My dearest Alana," he began, and I could almost hear his deep, soothing voice echoing in the sterile room. "If you are reading this, I am already gone, and your mother has likely shown you her true face. Do not let her break you. I am leaving you the only thing that actually matters: the truth and the keys to your future." I read faster, my breath catching in my throat despite the sharp pain in my healing lung. My father detailed everything. He knew exactly what my mother had been doing behind his back for years. He knew she had been slowly siphoning money from his personal accounts to fund the lavish lifestyle she believed our family required to maintain their elite social standing in Atlanta. He knew she was paying cash for my older sister Dominique to drive European luxury cars and to secure her position in the most exclusive high society circles. Dominique was always the golden child, the perfect reflection of my mother's superficial vanity, while I was the quiet one who preferred coding manuals over debutante balls. My father saw it all. He saw how my mother treated me like a burden, a dark mark on her polished image of black excellence. The second page of the letter made my pulse race even faster. My father wrote that he had spent his entire life building a financial software company from the ground up, creating algorithms that banks use to manage massive portfolios. But he realized too late that my mother was quietly positioning herself to seize control of the corporation the moment his health began to fail. So he outsmarted her. He wrote that he had secretly stripped the company of its most valuable assets. He transferred every single software patent, every algorithm, and every piece of intellectual property into a hidden blind trust registered in Delaware. He left the corporate shell for my mother to fight over, but the actual wealth, the untouchable core of the empire, was waiting for me. I turned to the final page, looking for the name of the trust or the legal contact, but there was only a small faded Polaroid photograph tucked into the fold of the paper. It was a picture of my father holding me when I was just a toddler. I flipped the photograph over and saw a sequence of 12 digits scrawled in thick black ink across the back. Before I could even process what those numbers meant, the heavy door to the intensive care unit burst open so violently it banged against the wall. My mother marched back into the room, her designer heels clicking sharply against the linoleum. But this time, she was not alone. She had two large hospital security guards trailing right behind her. "That woman is trespassing," my mother barked, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my grandmother. "She has no legal right to be in this room. Remove her immediately." My grandmother stood up tall, squaring her shoulders against the guards. "You cannot be serious, Yvonne," she said, her voice thick with disgust. "Your daughter just had surgery to inflate her lung, and you are throwing out her only support system because your ego is bruised. She is my daughter, and I am her legal guardian for exactly 24 more hours." My mother snapped back, entirely unbothered by the judgment in the guard's eyes. "You slapped me in a hospital. That is assault. Now get out before I have them call the police and press formal charges." The guards looked uncomfortable, but they moved toward my grandmother, gesturing toward the door. Estelle did not fight them. She knew a public scene would only give my mother exactly what she wanted, a chance to play the victim. My grandmother looked at me with a fierce, protective gaze. "I will be in the lobby, Alana," she promised. "I am not leaving this building without you." As soon as the door clicked shut behind my grandmother, the false mask of distress melted off my mother's face. She turned her cold, calculating eyes toward me and immediately noticed the paper clutched in my hands. Before I could hide it, she lunged forward across the bed and snatched the letter right out of my weak grip. I tried to reach for it, but the sharp, agonizing pain in my chest pinned me back against the mattress. "Give that back to me," I gasped, struggling to catch my breath. "It belongs to me." My mother let out a sharp, mocking laugh as she quickly scanned my father's words. Her eyes darted across the page, reading the confession he had left behind. Instead of looking guilty or ashamed, her lips curled into a victorious smirk. "You actually think Julian left you anything?" she scoffed, waving the paper in my face. "Your father was a weak man, Alana. He thought he was so clever playing games with trusts and patents. But he underestimated me. I already had my lawyers transfer the entire company into my name 3 weeks ago. I own the building, I own the bank accounts, and I own the brand. You get absolutely nothing." She crumpled my father's letter into a tight ball and tossed it into the trash can beside my bed. But she was moving too fast, too fueled by her own arrogance to notice that the Polaroid photograph had slipped from between the pages and landed perfectly flat on my blanket. I quickly slid my hand over the photo, hiding it from her view. My mother reached into her oversized designer handbag and pulled out a clipboard, dropping it heavily onto my lap. "What is this?" I asked, staring at the official hospital letterhead. "It is your discharge paperwork," she stated, adjusting her diamond bracelet. I spoke to the chief administrator. "You are breathing on your own, and you no longer require intensive care. I am pulling you out of this hospital right now." "The doctor said I need to stay for observation," I argued, panic finally starting to rise in my throat. "My lung just collapsed yesterday. I can barely sit up." "That sounds like a personal problem," my mother replied, her voice dripping with absolute venom. "You turn 19 years old tomorrow. You are a legal adult, which means you are no longer my financial or legal responsibility. I will not have my reputation dragged through the mud by a rebellious dropout daughter who causes scenes and disrupts my life." She leaned over the bed, bringing her face so close to mine I could smell the champagne she had been drinking at her sorority party. "Sign the discharge papers, Alana," she whispered coldly. "And when you leave this hospital, do not bother coming back to my house in Atlanta. Get your stuff out of my property by tomorrow morning, or I am leaving it all on the curb. You are entirely on your own." She turned around and walked out of the room, leaving me lying there with a freshly operated lung and no home to return to. She expected me to cry. She expected me to break down and beg for her mercy. But I did not shed a single tear. I just stared at the empty doorway, feeling a dangerous fire igniting in my chest. I slowly lifted my hand off the Polaroid photograph. My mother thought she had won. She thought she had taken my father's legacy and completely destroyed my future in one swift move. But she was too arrogant to read the fine print. She owned a corporate logo and a hollow building, but she had no idea that the actual wealth was locked behind a 12-digit offshore trust code. I stared at the numbers written in thick black ink on the back of the photo. I read them over and over again until they were permanently burned into my memory. 684-291-735502. My mother thought she was leaving me with nothing, but she had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to tear her entire world apart. I just had to bide my time. 10 years is a long time to remain a ghost. Over the past decade, I transformed myself from a discarded 19-year-old girl into the covert founder of a ruthless financial technology firm. I did not just start a business. I built an empire in the shadows. I took the 12-digit code my grandmother slipped to me in that hospital room and unlocked the Delaware trust my father left behind. The patents and algorithms inside were worth millions, and I used them to create a forensic accounting and debt acquisition firm that swallowed failing companies whole. I specialized in buying distressed, high-risk debts. I tracked shadow lenders and ruthlessly exposed corporate fraud. But I kept my name entirely out of the press. In the financial world, I was an anonymous force of nature, known only to the wealthiest investors. No one in my family had any idea I even existed in this space. To them, I was still the poor, pathetic loser they had thrown out on the street to die 10 long years ago. Tonight was the first time I allowed myself to be in the same room as the high society elite of Atlanta. It was a prestigious charity gala hosted at the city's most exclusive art museum. The ballroom was packed with wealthy guests trying to prove their high social status. I stood quietly near a towering arrangement of white orchids, holding a glass of champagne. I wore a simple black silk dress. I watched the crowd with silent amusement, analyzing the fake smiles and shallow networking happening all around me. I was taking a slow sip of my champagne when I heard a shrill voice cutting through the elegant jazz music playing in the background. It was a voice I had not heard in 10 years, but it still carried the same grating sense of entitlement. It was my older sister Dominique. I slowly turned my head and saw her holding court near the center of the room. She was draped in an obnoxious gold sequined gown that screamed for attention. Heavy diamond earrings weighed down her earlobes, and she held a glass of champagne like it was a prop in a stage play. Standing right beside her was her husband Trent. Trent was a venture capitalist who specialized in acting important while contributing absolutely nothing of value to society. He had slicked back blonde hair and wore a velvet dinner jacket that he clearly thought made him look sophisticated. He was the kind of man who used progressive buzzwords to mask his deep-seated arrogance and unearned privilege. For a moment, I just watched them. I knew things about their lives that they did not even know themselves. My forensic accounting algorithms had flagged Trent's venture capital firm 3 months ago. I knew his business credit cards were completely maxed out. I knew he was desperately searching for investors to save his sinking company. I knew Dominique was still spending money like water, totally blind to the fact that her perfect lifestyle was built on a crumbling foundation of massive unpayable debt. They were standing there laughing loudly with a group of local politicians projecting the ultimate image of wealth and success, while drowning in secret financial ruin. Then Dominique turned her head, and her eyes locked onto mine. The fake smile vanished from her face, instantly replaced by a look of absolute disgust. She blinked a few times as if she could not believe what she was seeing. She leaned over and whispered something into Trent's ear, pointing her manicured finger in my direction. Trent let out a loud, obnoxious laugh and whispered back. Instead of looking away, Dominique handed her drink to a passing waiter and began marching directly toward me. Trent followed closely behind her, wearing a condescending smirk that made my blood run cold. I did not move. I stood absolutely perfectly still, holding my champagne and waiting for the collision. As they approached, several other wealthy guests turned to watch the spectacle. Dominique loved an audience, and she was clearly ready to perform for the crowd. She stopped about 2 feet away from me, looking me up and down with exaggerated pity. She let out a loud, dramatic sigh that drew even more attention from the surrounding elite circle of donors. The entire room seemed to quiet down as people strained their necks to hear what was going to happen next. I took another very slow sip of my drink, refusing to let her see any fear. "Well, look who crawled out of the shelter," Dominique announced, her voice carrying clearly over the soft jazz music, so that every single person within a 20-foot radius could hear her insults. "I am honestly shocked the security guards let you pass the front doors tonight. Are you trying to network your way into a cheap catering job, Alana?" A few of the older women standing nearby let out soft, mocking laughs, covering their mouths with their hands as they stared at my unbranded silk dress. I looked at Dominique, taking in the quiet desperation hiding behind her heavy, expensive makeup. She was trying so hard to humiliate me, to prove her superiority to the strangers watching us. She desperately wanted me to shrink away in shame, just like the fragile teenager she remembered from our childhood. But I was not that broken girl anymore. I did not break eye contact. I just offered her a calm, completely unbothered smile. Dominique's face flushed a deep shade of crimson when she realized her insults had zero effect on me. Her jaw dropped wide open in pure shock that I had dared to stand my ground in front of her high society friends. Trent stepped forward, cutting her off. He puffed out his chest, trying to physically intimidate me with his height. He looked down at my simple black dress and let out a heavy scoff. Trent reached into the inner pocket of his velvet jacket and pulled out his thick money clip. He peeled off a crisp $100 bill and held it right over my glass. He dropped it into the champagne and smiled. "Just be a good girl and tell the valet to pull up my Porsche." I did not flinch as the $100 bill sank to the bottom of my champagne glass. The liquid bubbled around the paper. Dominique laughed, a high-pitched sound that grated against my ears and reminded me of every childhood humiliation I had ever endured in her shadow. Trent crossed his arms, looking incredibly pleased with his pathetic display of power. He truly believed he had just put me in my place in front of the entire Atlanta high society. I calmly reached 2 fingers into the liquid and pulled the soaked bill out. The paper dripped onto the polished marble floor. A waiter passed by holding a silver tray of empty glasses. I placed my ruined champagne flute on his tray and handed him the dripping $100 bill. "Keep it," I told the young man, keeping my voice entirely steady. Trent's credit cards were completely maxed out yesterday afternoon, so this might be the last bit of cash he sees for a very long time. The young waiter's eyes went wide, and he quickly hurried away, clutching the wet money. Trent's smug smile vanished instantly. His face turned a deep shade of crimson, and the thick vein in his neck began to throb visibly against his starched white collar. Dominique stopped laughing, her mouth falling open in pure shock. "How dare you?" she sputtered, her heavy diamond earrings swinging as she glared at me. But I was already turning away. I had no interest in arguing with them. I had a specific target in mind tonight, and I was not going to let their fragile egos slow me down. I scanned the crowded ballroom, looking past the towering arrangements of white orchids until I found exactly who I was looking for. Marcus Vance was an older billionaire investor, known for funding the absolute largest tech acquisitions in the state. I knew for a fact that Trent had been aggressively courting Marcus for the past 6 months. Trent's entire venture capital firm was currently running on fumes, and he desperately needed Marcus to inject $10 million into his latest portfolio just to keep the shadow lenders from foreclosing on his properties. I adjusted my simple black dress and walked straight toward the VIP lounge area where Marcus was standing. I heard heavy, desperate footsteps rushing up behind me. Trent had finally realized where I was going and what I was about to do. "Alana, stop right there," Trent hissed, trying to keep his voice low so the other wealthy donors would not hear him panicking. "You do not belong over there. Those are serious business people. You are going to embarrass Dominique, and you are going to embarrass me." I ignored his pathetic whispering and kept walking. My strides were measured and confident. I had spent the last 10 years dissecting the financial ruins of men exactly like Trent. They always built their delicate empires on hollow numbers and loud, empty bravado. I knew his entire pitch deck by heart because my firm had secretly acquired the distressed debt of 3 different startups he claimed were highly profitable. He was a complete fraud, and he was about to lose his biggest fish. I stepped into the exclusive VIP area just as Trent caught up to me, grabbing my elbow with a bruising grip. I smoothly pulled my arm away and smiled warmly at the older billionaire standing by the bar. "Mr. Vance," I said, extending my hand. "It is a pleasure to finally see you outside of a boring corporate boardroom." Marcus turned around and his stern face instantly softened into a bright, welcoming smile. He took my hand firmly. "Alana," he replied, his voice booming with genuine respect. "I had no idea you were attending tonight. I thought you preferred to stay completely anonymous at these charity functions." Trent froze completely solid. His hand hung awkwardly in the air where he had just tried to grab me. He looked back and forth between me and the powerful billionaire, his face draining of all color until he looked sick. "You two know each other," Trent stammered, his voice cracking. Marcus completely ignored Trent's ridiculous question and focused his attention entirely on me. I was just listening to this young man pitch his new medical technology portfolio, Marcus told me, gesturing vaguely toward Trent. "He claims his user acquisition costs are the absolute lowest in the industry right now. I tilted my head and looked directly into Trent's terrified eyes. "That is a very interesting claim," I said smoothly, "especially since Trent's primary medical startup just defaulted on a massive shadow loan last Thursday. In fact, if you review his pitch deck, you will see he completely fabricated the recurring revenue projections by burying his massive operational losses in a hidden shell company located in the Cayman Islands. He is not offering you a legitimate investment, Marcus. He is asking you to bail out a sinking ship with $10 million of your own capital before the federal auditors catch up to him." I delivered the facts cleanly, coldly, and without an ounce of hesitation. I did not need to raise my voice or make a scene. The absolute truth always cuts deepest when spoken quietly. Marcus Vance stared at me in total silence for a long, heavy moment. He knew my pristine reputation in the underground financial world. He knew my fintech firm never made a single claim unless we had the irrefutable data to back it up completely. Marcus slowly turned his gaze toward Trent. The billionaire looked absolutely disgusted. Trent opened his mouth to defend his lies, but no words came out. He was sweating profusely under the bright chandelier lights, his velvet jacket suddenly looking cheap and ridiculous. "You presented me with fraudulent numbers," Marcus stated, his voice cold and flat, echoing with finality. "Do not ever contact my office again." Marcus turned his back on Trent and walked away, disappearing into the elite crowd of guests. The silence that fell between Trent and me was deafening. Trent's entire career was built on that single investment deal, and I had just burned it to the ground in less than 60 seconds. He completely lost his mind. "You miserable little brat," Trent snarled, taking a sudden aggressive step toward me. He raised his hand, his face twisted in pure, uncontrolled rage. Before he could even swing, 3 massive men in black suits materialized out of nowhere. The venue security team had been watching me all night long. They knew I was the anonymous VIP donor who had quietly funded half the charity gala. They intercepted Trent instantly. One guard grabbed his raised arm and twisted it firmly behind his back, while the other 2 positioned themselves directly in front of me, forming an impenetrable human wall. "Ma'am, is this man bothering you?" The head of security asked me, his tone incredibly respectful. Trent struggled against the guard's crushing grip, looking completely bewildered. "Let go of me," he shouted, his voice echoing in the lounge. "She is just a nobody. She is a homeless college dropout who sneaked in here." The head of security ignored Trent completely, waiting only for my command. I looked at my arrogant brother-in-law struggling against the guards like a trapped, pathetic animal. I was just about to tell the security team to throw him out onto the dark street when a sharp, agonizing pain bit deeply into my left arm. I turned around and saw my mother, Yvonne. She had cut through the crowd of shocked onlookers like a jagged knife. She was draped in heavy, dripping diamonds and wore a furious, terrifying expression. Her long acrylic nails dug so deeply into my bare skin that I could feel them nearly breaking the surface. She leaned in close, her expensive perfume suffocating me in the tight space. "You are coming to Sunday dinner tomorrow to fix this," she whispered venomously, her voice shaking with absolute rage, "or I swear to God I will ruin you in this city. I will ruin." I sat perfectly still and let her finish her unhinged rant. I let the silence stretch out, allowing her toxic words to settle over the lavish spread of food. They all thought they had won. They thought their combined aggression and threats had finally broken my spirit. Dominique was smirking again, adjusting her diamond necklace while Trent crossed his arms and looked at me with pure triumphant arrogance. He thought he had successfully cornered me into submission. I slowly reached out and picked up the heavy silver butter knife resting beside my porcelain plate. I lifted my crystal water glass with my other hand. I gently tapped the silver blade against the crystal rim. A sharp, clear ping rang out, cutting through the heavy tension in the dining room. Everyone stopped moving. My mother glared at me, confused by my calm demeanor. The pastor swallowed hard, staring at the silver knife in my hand. Dominique's smug smile slowly faded into a look of deep uncertainty. I looked directly at my brother-in-law, offering him a cold, empty smile that did not reach my eyes. "Trent, You do not want my 2% shares to save your venture capital business, I stated loudly and clearly, watching his confident expression begin to freeze. You want my shares because the IRS is auditing you on Tuesday morning for embezzling $500,000 from Pastor Davis' church. The heavy silver fork slipped from Pastor Davis' hand and clattered loudly against his fine china plate. The sound echoed through the massive dining room like a gunshot. His mouth fell open and he stared at Trent with absolute horror. The color completely drained from the pastor's face as he processed the magnitude of what I had just revealed. The sacred building fund he had been boasting about all evening was entirely gone, and the thief was sitting right next to him, eating my mother's expensive roasted lamb. Dominique shot up from her chair so fast it tipped over and crashed onto the hardwood floor. She pointed her trembling finger across the table at me, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. "You are a pathetic, jealous liar," Dominique screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You have always been obsessed with destroying my happiness. Trent is a respected venture capitalist, and you are just a bitter dropout making up insane stories because you could never land a man like him. You are trying to ruin the only good thing this family has left because your own life is a miserable failure." I did not flinch at her screaming. I did not raise my voice to match her frantic energy. I simply reached into my small clutch and pulled out my phone. My mother always loved to show off her wealth, and she had recently installed a massive 80-inch smart television on the dining room wall specifically to display digital art during her elite dinner parties. It took me exactly 3 seconds to bypass her unsecured network and cast my screen directly to the monitor. The digital painting of a French countryside vanished instantly. In its place, the bright glowing screen displayed a highly detailed financial ledger. The numbers were massive and impossible to ignore. On the left side of the screen, I pulled up the exact routing numbers and transaction history of the Church Expansion Fund. On the right side of the screen, I displayed the secret offshore accounts registered under Trent's Hollow venture capital firm in the Cayman Islands. The red highlighted transfer dates matched perfectly. Down to the exact cent, $500,000 had been systematically drained from the church accounts and funneled directly into Trent's failing business over the past 6 months. I slowly put my phone down on the table and looked at the pastor. The money did not go toward a new community center. "Pastor Davis," I stated calmly, watching the older man's chest heave with panic. "It went toward paying off the shadow lenders that Trent has been hiding from for the past year. Every single donation your congregation made is currently sitting in an offshore account, attempting to desperately keep his fraudulent business afloat." Pastor Davis slowly turned his head to look at Trent. His hands were shaking as he gripped the edge of the mahogany table. "Is this true, Trent?" The pastor choked out his voice, barely a whisper. "Tell me this is some kind of sick misunderstanding. Tell me you did not steal from the house of God." Trent looked like he was about to physically vomit. His confident, arrogant posture had completely collapsed. Sweat was pouring down his forehead and soaking into the collar of his expensive shirt. He looked frantically around the room, searching for an escape route that did not exist. He pulled at his tie, gasping for air, as the undeniable proof of his crimes glowed brightly on the wall behind him. "It is a clerical error," Trent stammered, taking a step back from the table and wiping the sweat from his brow. "It is just a massive misunderstanding with the accounting software. The funds were simply reallocated into a high-yield, temporary holding account to maximize the return on the church's investment. I was going to move the money back before the audit, I swear. The bank made a routing mistake, and I was going to fix it first thing tomorrow morning." He was babbling completely incoherent lies, but the evidence on the screen was absolute. The offshore accounts were registered under a shell corporation that traced directly back to his personal signature. He had stolen the money to fund Dominique's lavish lifestyle and his own failing investments, and now he was trapped. Dominique stared at the screen, her eyes wide with terror as she finally realized her perfect high society life was built on stolen charity funds. She looked at her husband with pure disgust, finally seeing the pathetic fraud he truly was. I expected my mother to explode in righteous fury. I expected her to fall to her knees and apologize to the pastor for bringing a thief into her home. Her entire social standing relied on her reputation within that megachurch. If the congregation found out her son-in-law had stolen their donations, she would be permanently exiled from the elite circles she worshipped. But my mother did not gasp in shock. She did not look at the glowing screen with horror. Instead, Yvonne slammed both of her hands flat onto the dining table with such explosive force that her wineglass tipped over, spilling dark red liquid across the pristine white linen tablecloth. The sudden violence of her movement made everyone jump. She did not look at Trent. She did not look at the pastor. She glared directly across the table at me, her eyes burning with a terrifying, calculating darkness. The fake mask of the blessed Christian matriarch shattered completely, revealing the ruthless monster hiding underneath. "I already knew about the church money, you idiot," Yvonne screamed, her voice vibrating with absolute raw malice. The entire room froze. The pastor let out a sharp gasp, clutching his chest as he stared at my mother in complete disbelief. Even Dominique looked shocked, stumbling backward away from the table. Yvonne leaned forward, ignoring the spilled wine soaking into her expensive silk suit. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger right at my face. "I have known about the missing funds for 3 weeks!" she yelled, her true nature completely exposed. "Why do you think I invited you here tonight? Why do you think we demanded you sign over those shares? That is exactly why I needed your 2%, you arrogant little brat. I needed your shares to cover his tracks and save my own reputation before the federal auditors destroyed this entire family." The pastor looked as though the polished hardwood floor had suddenly dropped out from underneath his expensive leather shoes. He stared at my mother with his mouth hanging slightly open, completely unable to comprehend the absolute moral bankruptcy of the woman sitting at the head of the elegant table. His eyes darted from the massive smart television displaying the damning offshore bank routing numbers back to my mother's perfectly powdered face. "Yvonne, you knew," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of genuine horror and profound betrayal. "You sat in the front pew of my sanctuary every single Sunday morning, singing hymns and quoting scripture, knowing perfectly well that your own son-in-law was robbing the congregation blind. You knew that the money meant for the community outreach programs and the new children wing was sitting in a Cayman Islands bank account." My mother did not even flinch. She did not lower her eyes or offer a single word of apology to the spiritual leader she had publicly worshipped just 20 minutes earlier. Instead, she scoffed, waving her manicured hand dismissively, as if the pastor were nothing more than a minor annoyance interrupting her dinner. "Oh, please spare me the righteous indignation and the dramatic tears, pastor." She snapped, her voice icy and completely devoid of basic human empathy. "I was handling the situation entirely in-house to protect the family legacy. Trent made an incredibly stupid and desperate financial mistake, but exposing him to the authorities would have ruined Dominique's pristine social standing. It would have completely tarnished the flawless image we have spent decades building in the upper echelons of this city. I was simply doing what any fiercely protective matriarch would do to secure her bloodline and maintain our status. The church is basically a social club that my family heavily funds anyway, so I viewed it as a temporary internal loan." Pastor Davis slumped back into his heavy velvet chair, looking physically sick. He was completely powerless against her ruthless rationalization, and they both knew it. My mother then slowly stood up from her heavy mahogany chair. She smoothed down the front of her ruined silk suit, completely ignoring the dark wine stain that was spreading across the expensive fabric from where she had slammed her hands down. She walked slowly around the edge of the large dining table, her heels clicking sharply against the wood, until she was standing directly behind Trent's chair. She placed her hands firmly on his shoulders, not in a gesture of maternal comfort, but as a blatant display of absolute ownership and control. "You see, Alana?" My mother continued, pacing her words with deliberate theatrical precision as she glared at me. "You always walk into this house thinking you hold all the cards. You think you are the brilliant, brave whistleblower coming to save the day and expose the wicked sinners of the family. You cast your little glowing screen to my television, And you honestly believed you had cornered me into a desperate panic. You thought I was just a clueless, grieving widow who let her arrogant son-in-law handle the complex corporate finances while I hosted charity garden parties and drank champagne. She let out a sharp, condescending laugh that echoed against the sparkling crystal chandelier above our heads. It was a terrifying sound, completely empty of any real joy or humor. "You have always underestimated me, Alana," my mother said, stepping away from Trent and stopping right beside my chair, looking down at me with absolute, unvarnished contempt. "You think your father was the only one in this marriage with actual business acumen? You think because Julian left you that pathetic little 2% share of his old holding company that you somehow earned a permanent seat at the adult table. You refused to sign the contract tonight, thinking you could hold this entire family hostage with your stubbornness. You thought you could use Trent's pathetic little embezzlement scandal to leverage your way back into my good graces. Or force me to beg on my knees for your signature. Well, let me educate you on how real power actually operates in the ruthless corporate world you pretend to understand." My mother leaned down, placing both of her hands flat on the table, leaning her face so incredibly close to mine that I could smell the heavy, expensive designer perfume radiating off her skin. "I did not actually need your signature tonight, Alana," she whispered, her voice dripping with a venomous, triumphant glee. "Getting you to sign over your 2% voluntarily was just the cleanest, quietest way to restructure the holding company and quickly bury Trent's massive financial mistake before the auditors arrived on Tuesday. But I never put all my faith in a bitter, ungrateful child who despises her own blood. When you started dodging our phone calls last month, I took matters completely into my own hands. I went to the private wealth division of the bank, and I took out a massive second mortgage on this entire sprawling estate. I leveraged every single piece of valuable artwork, every piece of antique furniture, and the very ground we are sitting on right now. And with that massive influx of capital, I quietly went behind your back and bought out the remaining 51% of your father's old corporate partners." Dominique let out a sudden loud gasp of pure delight, her face lighting up brightly as she finally realized what our mother had actually done. Even Trent stopped sweating for a brief moment, a greedy, hopeful smile slowly creeping back onto his pale, clammy face. My mother stood up straight, crossing her arms over her chest and looking down at me like a victorious, conquering queen who had just crushed a minor rebellion. "I am now the undisputed majority shareholder of the entire holding company," she declared, her voice ringing with absolute, unquestionable authority. "I control the executive board. I control the massive assets. I control the entire future of the corporate legacy Julian left behind. And as the majority shareholder, I held an emergency executive vote early this morning. I pushed through a complete aggressive corporate restructuring without needing your permission. We issued millions of new company shares, effectively diluting your precious 2% stake down to absolutely zero. You have nothing left, Alana. No leverage, no money, and no connection whatsoever to this family empire." My mother walked gracefully back to her seat at the head of the table, looking completely and utterly satisfied with her brutal execution of power. She picked up her linen napkin and delicately dabbed at her mouth, acting as though she had just swatted a minor annoying insect away from her perfect life. The pastor remained completely silent, staring at his plate, too intimidated by my mother's ruthless display of wealth and absolute power to say another word about his stolen church funds. Dominique was practically glowing with malicious joy, leaning her head affectionately against Trent's shoulder as they both glared across the table at me, waiting eagerly for me to finally break down crying. They desperately wanted me to scream and throw a massive emotional tantrum. They wanted me to realize that I had been completely outsmarted and ruthlessly stripped of my only valuable asset. They wanted me to crawl out of the heavy iron gates of the estate, broken, humiliated, and utterly defeated, never to return. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not even blink or break my calm posture. I sat perfectly still in my comfortable velvet dining chair and looked slowly around the beautiful room. I looked at the expensive imported paintings hanging on the walls, the hand-woven rugs covering the floor, and the solid brick walls of the sprawling mansion my mother had just heavily mortgaged to the bank. I slowly reached out and picked up my crystal wine glass by the stem. I swirled the dark red liquid gently, watching it coat the sides of the expensive glass. I brought the smooth crystal rim to my lips and took a very slow, very deliberate sip, savoring the rich, earthy flavor as the entire room watched me in confused, tense silence. I lowered the glass gently back to the polished mahogany table and looked directly into my mother's triumphant, glowing eyes. I offered her a warm, genuine smile that caused her confident expression to falter for the very first time. "Mother," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and completely relaxed, "did you actually read the intellectual property clauses before you mortgaged this entire house?" The silence that followed my question was so absolute that I could hear the faint ticking of the antique grandfather clock out in the grand hallway. My mother's face remained frozen in that mask of arrogant superiority, but a tiny flicker of doubt finally pierced through her dark eyes. Her perfectly manicured hands, which were still resting flat on the mahogany table, twitched ever so slightly. The heavy scent of roasted lamb and expensive floral arrangements suddenly felt suffocating in the tense air. "What are you talking about?" Yvonne snapped, her voice losing a fraction of its theatrical confidence. "I own 51% of your father's holding company. I own the corporate name. I own the physical offices downtown. I own every single server and every piece of hardware inside that building. I had top-tier corporate lawyers review every single line of that acquisition contract before I handed over the equity of this estate. You are just trying to bluff your way out of total defeat, Alana. You are trying to sound smart because you know I have completely outmaneuvered you." I let out a soft, genuine laugh and leaned back in my velvet chair, feeling the plush fabric against my back. "You own a logo, Mother," I said, shaking my head slowly. "You own a fancy corporate letterhead, an expensive lease on a downtown office space, and a massive pile of rapidly accumulating corporate debt. You bought a hollow shell. You bought the shiny luxury vehicle, but you forgot to check if there was an actual engine under the hood before you signed away the deed to this house." Trent suddenly let out a strangled, gasping sound from across the table. His venture capitalist brain was finally catching up to the terrifying reality of my words. He knew exactly how tech companies were structured. He knew that physical servers and office leases meant absolutely nothing if the proprietary software was housed somewhere else. He looked at my mother with wide, terrified eyes, his chest heaving as the panic set back in. His breathing became loud and ragged in the quiet room. "Yvonne, what did you buy?" Trent demanded, his voice cracking with pure hysteria. He grabbed the edges of the table, his knuckles turning white. "What exactly was listed in the asset acquisition schedule when you signed those papers?" "I bought the company, Trent," my mother barked back, her flawless composure finally beginning to crack under his sudden panic. She shot him a venomous look, hating that he was questioning her absolute authority. "I bought the entity that Julian built. I bought the legacy." "You bought the physical entity," I corrected her, my voice slicing smoothly through their rising panic. "But Dad was not stupid, Mother. He knew exactly who you were, and he knew exactly what you would do the second he was gone. He knew you would try to liquidate his life work, to fund your endless social climbing, or hand it over to whatever fast-talking con artist Dominique happened to marry, just to keep up appearances." My mother flinched as if I had physically struck her across the face. "How dare you!" she hissed, her face turning a blotchy, uneven shade of red. "Julian trusted me. He left me this house. He left me the life insurance he trusted me to manage the family. If he trusted you, he would not have handed me that sealed envelope in the intensive care unit 10 years ago," I said, keeping my eyes locked dead onto hers, refusing to let her look away. "Do you remember that day, Mother? Do you remember rushing into his hospital room while the life support machines were beeping? You were perfectly dressed for a charity luncheon reeking of expensive perfume, complaining loudly to the nurses that his sudden illness was deeply inconvenient for your social calendar. Do you remember snatching a stack of legal documents right out of my hands because you thought I was trying to sneak a peek at his life insurance policy? Yvonne's eyes widened as the memory clearly hit her. She remembered. Her breathing hitched. She had been so obsessed with securing her own financial safety net that afternoon that she had completely ignored the actual substance of what my father was doing in his final days. She had treated his death as an administrative hurdle. You took the insurance papers and the property deeds, I continued, my voice dropping to a cold, hard register that made the pastor flinch in his seat. But you completely ignored the plain white envelope he had already slipped into my jacket pocket. You were so focused on the immediate cash payout that you did not even bother to ask why his top corporate attorney had been sitting by his hospital bed for 3 straight hours that morning. What was in the envelope? Dominique asked, her voice barely a whisper. Her hands were gripping her heavy napkin, twisting the linen into knots as her perfect world continued to collapse around her. She looked at me with a mixture of terror and reluctant awe. The future, I replied, looking briefly at my sister before turning my attention back to the woman at the head of the table. 10 years ago, Dad took every single piece of valuable intellectual property he had ever created, every single complex algorithm, every software patent, every trademark, and every line of proprietary code that actually makes that company profitable. He stripped it all out of the main holding company and transferred it completely into a private Delaware trust. The color drained from my mother's face completely, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very old. She stumbled backward slightly, her knees hitting the edge of her heavy dining chair. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in frantic denial. "No, the lawyers would have seen that. The bank would have seen that before they approved the massive second mortgage on this house. They would never have given me the capital if the company was empty." The bank only looked at the surface-level corporate revenue streams. "Mother," I explained calmly, enjoying the absolute devastation washing over her features. They looked at the massive cash flow coming in from the software licensing, but they did not look deep enough to see who actually owned the underlying licenses. The holding company you just mortgaged this entire beautiful estate to purchase pays a massive monthly licensing fee to that Delaware trust just to legally use the software. The company you bought is nothing but a glorified tenant, renting the rights to Dad's genius. Trent suddenly grabbed his chest, leaning over the table as if he could not pull enough oxygen into his lungs. He was hyperventilating, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. He had embezzled $500,000 from the church, relying entirely on the fact that my mother was about to bail him out with her new powerful majority shareholder status. But now he realized the company she bought was effectively worthless. There was no bailout coming. There was no hidden cash reserve. He was going to federal prison, and he knew it. "You are lying!" Yvonne screamed, suddenly slamming her fists down onto the table again, splashing more wine across the pristine linen and knocking over a silver candlestick. "You are a manipulative little liar. Julian would never do that to me. He would never leave the core of his empire in some invisible trust where I could not reach it. He did not do it to punish you," I said, my voice softening just a fraction, though the truth was still a lethal blade. "He did it to protect the legacy. He knew you would strip the company for parts. He knew you would leverage it for cash to buy your way into elite society and fund your ridiculous vanity projects. He wanted to make sure the actual value, the things he spent his entire life building, could never be touched by your greed." My mother was shaking violently now. Her perfectly styled hair was coming undone, strands falling into her face as she stared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. She had risked absolutely everything. She had put a second mortgage on her beloved mansion, the ultimate symbol of her wealth, her status, and her entire identity to buy a company that owned absolutely nothing of value. If the hollow holding company failed to pay the massive licensing fees to the trust, it would go bankrupt. And if the company went bankrupt, the bank would immediately seize her house. She had literally handed the keys of her precious kingdom back to the bank for a worthless stack of paper. "And who controls this supposed trust?" Yvonne sneered, her voice dripping with desperation and venom. She leaned forward, planting her hands on the table, clinging to one last shred of delusional hope. Let me guess. Some dead lawyer from 10 years ago. Some ancient corporate trustee who I can tie up in endless litigation for the next 2 decades. I will sue the estate Alana. I will drag this into probate court until that trust is bled completely dry by legal fees. I will ruin you. I smiled, taking another slow, deliberate sip of my wine. I let the silence stretch, letting her frantic, desperate energy fill the expansive room. I looked at the pastor who was still frozen in shock, staring at his plate. I looked at Trent, who was weeping silently into his shaking hands, ruined and exposed. I looked at Dominique, whose entire high society identity had just evaporated into thin air. And then I looked back at my mother, meeting her furious gaze with absolute calm. No, I replied smoothly, setting the crystal glass down softly on the polished wood. I do. I memorized the offshore identification number and the trustee access codes the night before you kicked me out into the street. The absolute silence that descended upon the dining room was deafening. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet that seemed to suck all the air out of the grand space. My mother stared at me, her mouth slightly open, her dark eyes wide with a horrific realization. The flawless, meticulously planned corporate coup she thought she had executed just hours ago was actually a financial suicide mission. She had mortgaged her entire life. She had leveraged this massive, beautiful estate and her entire social identity for a ghost. She bought a hollow shell, and I held the only key to the actual treasure that could save her. Her chest heaved under her ruined silk suit as she tried to form words, but nothing came out. The great Yvonne, the woman who always had a sharp insult or a commanding threat ready, was finally completely speechless. She just stared at me, her entire reality crumbling into dust right before her eyes. The spell was broken by the sudden violent sound of a heavy wooden chair scraping harshly against the polished hardwood floor. Pastor Davis stood up, his massive frame towering over the ruined dinner table. His face, which had been pale and sweating just moments ago, was now flushed with a righteous, furious indignation. He looked at the glowing smart television displaying the damning offshore bank accounts, and then he looked down at my mother, as if he were staring at a complete stranger. He had spent years eating her food, accepting her donations and praising her as a pillar of the Atlanta Christian community. Now he was looking at a common criminal who had plotted to cover up the theft of his congregation. Yvonne the pastor said, his voice booming with the practiced deep cadence of a Sunday sermon, but laced with a very genuine, very raw disgust. You sat in my private office just last week, praying with me over the missing building funds. You held my hands, you cried real tears, and you asked the Lord to guide the federal authorities in their investigation. You demanded justice for the church, all while knowing perfectly well that your own son-in-law was the thief who took bread from the mouths of our community. You knew he was robbing us blind, and you said nothing. My mother snapped out of her shock, turning her desperate panic toward the pastor. She scrambled out of her chair, nearly tripping over the thick oriental rug. "Pastor, please, you have to understand," she pleaded, reaching out a trembling manicured hand toward his dark suit. "I was going to fix it, I swear to you. I was going to use the holding company to replace every single dollar before the official audit on Tuesday. I was protecting the church from a massive public scandal. I was protecting your reputation as much as mine. We are family, Pastor." "You were protecting your own vanity," Yvonne the pastor thundered, slapping his heavy hand against the mahogany table, causing the silver cutlery to rattle. "You were willing to use the hard-earned tithes of our working-class congregation as a personal slush fund to maintain your sick illusion of high society perfection. You did not care about the church. You cared about your country club status. You are morally bankrupt." He took a deep breath, adjusting his collar as he delivered the final crushing blow to her ego. "Effective immediately, you are permanently stripped of your position as the chairwoman of the executive board. You are completely stripped of your leadership role in the women ministry. I will be calling an emergency meeting of the elders tonight to inform them of your direct complicity in this monumental fraud. You are no longer welcome to lead or speak in my church ever again." My mother let out a strangled, agonizing cry, burying her face in her hands. The church executive board was her entire social universe. It was her crown, and the pastor had just publicly and brutally ripped it from her head. She was ruined in the one circle she cared about above all else. Without that title, she was just a broke widow in a mortgaged house. The absolute total destruction of my mother's empire was apparently the breaking point for Dominique. My perfect golden sister looked frantically around the table, realizing that her protective bubble of endless wealth and untouchable status had just violently burst. Her mother was a social pariah facing complete financial ruin, and her husband was a confirmed embezzler staring down a very long federal prison sentence. Dominique immediately went into pure selfish survival mode. She burst into loud, dramatic tears, throwing her hands over her face and letting out a perfectly pitched sob. She completely abandoned Trent, leaving him sweating and shaking in his chair. Pastor Davis Dominique cried, rushing around the table and grabbing the sleeve of the pastor's dark suit, her diamond rings flashing under the chandelier. "You have to believe me, Pastor. I had absolutely no idea about any of this. Trent lied to me about everything. He told me the business was thriving. He told me his venture capital fund was breaking records and closing massive deals. I am just a devoted, trusting wife. I would never, ever touch stolen church money. Please, Pastor, you know my heart. You know I am a good Christian woman." She looked incredibly convincing, with her expensive mascara running down her cheeks and her delicate shoulders shaking. She played the naive, betrayed housewife perfectly, begging the powerful spiritual leader for amnesty while actively throwing the man she married directly under the bus. She was perfectly willing to let Trent rot in a federal cell if it meant she could keep her country club memberships. Trent watched his wife perform this desperate, calculated act of self-preservation, and something deep inside him finally snapped. The panicked, cornered fraudster suddenly vanished, replaced by a man who realized he had absolutely nothing left to lose. His fake progressive ally persona was gone. His wealthy venture capitalist ego was gone. If he was going down, he was going to drag his perfect, treacherous wife right down into the mud with him. Trent let out a harsh, manic laugh that echoed sharply in the large, silent room. He stood up so fast his heavy dining chair crashed backward onto the floor. He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger right at Dominique's tear-stained face. "Do not you dare play the innocent victim, you manipulative parasite!" Trent screamed, his voice cracking with pure hysterical rage. The veins in his neck were bulging as he stared at the woman he supposedly loved. "You knew exactly where that money was coming from. You sat right next to me in the home office while I altered the routing numbers. You watched me transfer those church funds into the offshore accounts, and you literally cheered." Dominique froze, her fake tears instantly drying up as she stared at her furious husband in absolute terror. Her mouth opened and closed silently. "Trent, you are crazy," she stammered, taking a stumbling step backward away from him. "You are lying to save yourself." "Do not listen to him, Pastor." Trent took a heavy step toward her, his face twisted in pure, unfiltered hatred. The perfect high society marriage was completely detonating right in front of our eyes, burning to ash in the middle of the dining room. "I am lying," Trent yelled, leaning aggressively toward her, his voice raw and echoing with absolute finality. "Then explain to the pastor how you managed to spend $40,000 of it 3 days later on the down payment for your new G-Wagon." The silence that followed Trent's explosive accusation was absolute and deafening. Dominique stared at her husband with her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, completely unable to formulate a lie fast enough to cover the $40,000 down payment on her luxury vehicle. The pastor did not even wait for her to try and defend herself. He had heard enough. He turned his back on the entire family without uttering another single word. His heavy footsteps echoed across the marble foyer, and the massive oak front door slammed shut behind him with a resounding thud that seemed to shake the very foundations of the estate. With the departure of the pastor, the last shred of Yvonne's carefully maintained sanity completely evaporated. She watched the door close, and a visceral shudder ran through her entire body. Her primary audience, her spiritual validator, her connection to the elite moral high ground of the city, was gone forever. She slowly turned her gaze back to the dining room table where Trent was still panting heavily, and Dominique was frantically trying to wipe the running mascara from her cheeks. "Shut up!" Yvonne hissed, her voice trembling with a terrifying, deeply unhinged rage. "Shut up, both of you, right now. I will not listen to another word of this pathetic bickering in my dining room. You are acting like common street trash, and I will not have it in my presence." Dominique flinched, shrinking back into her velvet chair, but Trent looked too far gone to care. Yvonne did not give him the chance to speak again. She slammed her manicured hands flat onto the table and leaned forward, her eyes locking onto me with a level of pure, concentrated hatred that actually made the air in the room feel physically colder. "You malicious little brat!" Yvonne spat, her voice dropping into a venomous, guttural whisper. "You planned this entire evening just to ruin me. You sat there quietly and watched me build this family legacy, and you waited for the exact perfect moment to try and tear it all down to the ground. You brought that screen, you brought those bank records, and you deliberately waited until the pastor was sitting at my table to humiliate me." I did not say a word. I just sat there watching her unravel, observing the absolute destruction of the untouchable matriarch who had terrorized me for my entire life. My mother began to pace back and forth behind her massive mahogany chair, her heels clicking sharply against the floorboards. "You think you are so brilliant, Alana?" She continued, her voice rising in pitch and volume with every single word. "You think because you memorized some offshore trust number that you have somehow won this war? You think you can walk into my house and dismantle my entire life just because Julian felt sorry for you and left you a little safety net?" She let out a sharp, manic laugh, tossing her head back as if she were speaking to an invisible audience. "You are nothing," she screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You are exactly what you have always been since the day you walked away from the elite business program I paid for. You are nothing but a pathetic, ungrateful college dropout." The memory of that day hung heavily in the air between us, a bitter reminder of the exact moment I had refused to play her twisted game any longer. My mother had spent years grooming me to be another corporate pawn, another perfectly dressed clone to parade around her social circles just like Dominique. She had meticulously controlled every aspect of my education, dictating which classes I took, which professors I agreed with, and which powerful, wealthy alumni I needed to aggressively court at her tedious dinner parties. When I finally realized she was planning to use my expensive degree to force me into a subservient administrative role at the family firm, working directly under Trent's arrogant management, I simply walked away. I packed my bags in the middle of the night and dropped out of the prestigious university program she loved to brag about at her country club luncheons. She had immediately gone into intense damage control mode, telling all her wealthy friends and sorority sisters that I was a tragic disappointment who simply could not handle the rigorous academic pressure. She never told them I left to teach myself complex software architecture and quietly build the very systems her entire fake empire relied upon. She needed everyone in her elite circle to believe I was a hopeless failure because the actual truth that I completely refused to be controlled by her was far too humiliating for her fragile ego to bear. She had used that college dropout label as a weapon against me at every single holiday and family gathering for the past decade, wielding it like a club to keep me firmly in my place as the family outcast. "You think this little stunt changes who you are?" Yvonne mocked, leaning over the table again, her eyes wide and wild with a terrifying manic energy. "You think exposing Trent makes you my equal in this room? I am Yvonne Sterling. I sit on the board of the most exclusive country club in this entire state. I have elite sorority connections that run deep into the governor's mansion, the state supreme court, and every major financial institution in this city. I have wealthy, powerful friends who would utterly destroy your little pathetic life with a single phone call if I simply ask them to. My sisters from the Alumni Association would blacklist you from ever securing a respectable job in the corporate world before breakfast tomorrow morning. You are a nobody, Alana. You have always been a nobody. She was hyperventilating now, completely blinded by her own delusions of grandeur. She was desperately clinging to the hollow social titles that meant absolutely nothing in the face of federal embezzlement charges and massive corporate fraud. She was pulling out her social resume as if a country club membership could somehow protect her from the devastating financial reality of the hollow shell company she had just purchased. And most importantly, my mother sneered, her eyes flashing with a desperate, chaotic triumph. I still own this house. I still own the ground you are sitting on right now. You might have tricked me into buying a hollow shell company, but I am still the queen of this estate, and I want you out of my sight this exact second. Yvonne spun around and snatched her expensive smartphone off the sideboard, her hands shaking so violently she almost dropped the device. I am calling the private security guards for the gated community right now, she threatened, tapping the screen with a manic, frantic energy. I am going to have armed men walk into this dining room, drag you out of that chair by your hair, and physically throw you into the street like the trash you are. And if you ever try to come near my property again, I will have you arrested for trespassing. Dominique sat up slightly, a tiny glimmer of malicious hope returning to her tear-stained face as she watched our mother take charge. Even Trent looked up, wiping the sweat from his forehead, eager to watch me be humiliated and thrown out into the cold night. They all desperately needed a victory. They needed to see me punished to make themselves feel powerful again in the midst of their absolute ruin. My mother held the phone to her ear, tapping her foot impatiently on the floorboards, a cruel, vindictive smile stretching across her face as she waited for the security dispatch to answer. I slowly stood up from my chair, taking my time. I smoothed out the fabric of my simple tailored pantsuit, completely unbothered by her frantic threats. I walked calmly around the edge of the dining table, my movements slow and deliberate, until I was standing right in front of her. As the dispatch operator answered the call on the other end of the line, I reached out and gently wrapped my fingers around her wrist. I slowly lowered her hand, pulling the phone away from her ear before she could utter a single word to the guards. My mother stared at me in pure shock, completely paralyzed by my absolute lack of fear. You do not own this house anymore, Mother. My mother's phone clattered onto the polished mahogany floor, sliding deep under the heavy dining table and coming to a rest against the thick oriental rug. She stared at my hand, which was still firmly wrapped around her wrist, her mouth opening and closing silently, like she was suffocating on the very air in her own dining room. For a woman who had spent her entire life aggressively dictating the physical and emotional boundaries of everyone around her, being physically stopped by the daughter she despised was a completely incomprehensible reality. She yanked her arm back, cradling her wrist against her chest as if my skin had physically burned her. "You are speaking absolute nonsense," she hissed, her voice shaking wildly and completely lacking the booming theatrical authority it held just seconds ago. "I signed the mortgage papers myself, Alana. I hold the deed to this property. I pay the premium. You cannot just walk in here and declare my estate yours because you are throwing a childish tantrum over losing your inheritance." I let my hand fall casually back to my side and looked around the dining room, taking in the absolute terror radiating from my family. Dominique was practically hyperventilating, clutching the padded edges of her velvet chair, while Trent looked like his heart was about to completely give out. "Mother, you really should have paid closer attention to the actual mechanics of the modern financial world, instead of just memorizing the last names of the country club board members," I said, my voice calm and devastatingly steady. "You see, when you decided to aggressively pursue the hostile buyout of Dad's holding company behind my back, you ran into a massive, unavoidable problem. You could not just walk into a traditional Tier 1 bank and secure a pristine commercial loan of that magnitude. Your credit is completely ruined." Yvonne's face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of gray beneath her expensive foundation. Dominique let out a tiny, sharp gasp, finally realizing that her own lavish lifestyle was about to be dragged out into the harsh lighting of the dining room. Yes, Dominique. I continued, turning my gaze to my perfectly manicured sister, who was shrinking back into her seat. Traditional banks actually look at detailed spending habits. They look at the fact that Mother has been quietly funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars into your personal checking accounts to cover up the fact that Trent's venture capital firm has been bleeding money for 3 consecutive years. The major banks saw the massive risky lines of credit Mother took out to pay for your exclusive memberships, your luxury vacations to St. Bart's, and that ridiculous designer wardrobe you parade around in. Mother's financial profile was a giant flashing red flag for any reputable lending institution in this entire state. "So you had to get creative, Mother," I said, turning my attention back to the matriarch of the family. "You had to bypass the heavily regulated banking system and wade straight into the murky, unregulated waters of shadow lending. You found a subprime private equity lender who was more than happy to give you the massive influx of liquid cash you desperately needed to buy the holding company. But those kinds of alternative lenders do not play by the same polite rules as your friendly neighborhood bank. They bury aggressive predatory clauses deep inside the fine print of their contracts. They rely entirely on people exactly like you, people blinded by pure arrogance, and so desperate to maintain a flawless public image that they never bother to hire a proper corporate attorney to read the actual terms of the agreement." Trent was violently shaking his head back and forth, his background in finance finally putting the terrifying pieces together. He knew exactly what kind of ruthless shadow lenders I was talking about. "But what does that have to do with your little accounting software?" Yvonne demanded, her voice pitching higher, completely panicked by the sudden realization that she was entirely out of her depth. "You build spreadsheets, Alana. You do not control private equity lenders." "That is where you have always been tragically wrong about my career," I replied, smoothing an invisible crease on my tailored jacket. "My fintech company does not just build simple accounting software, Mother. We build complex predictive algorithms that analyze global market vulnerabilities and track hidden corporate liabilities. But our primary business model, the way we actually generate massive amounts of capital, is by acquiring and restructuring distressed high-risk debt portfolios. We monitor the shadow lending markets, constantly looking for highly overleveraged assets. We buy predatory loans at a fraction of the cost from private lenders who want to quickly offload their risk. And then we take absolute total control of the underlying assets." My mother backed away from me, her legs trembling so violently she had to grab the back of her heavy dining chair just to keep herself standing upright. She was finally beginning to understand the massive, inescapable trap she had willingly walked right into. When my proprietary software flagged a massive high-risk subprime loan secured by the exact address of my childhood home, my system automatically alerted me. I explained, stepping closer to the center of the table. My firm tracked the entire transaction from the very beginning. "We watched you put this beautiful historic house up as collateral to a group of ruthless private lenders who specialize in aggressively seizing luxury real estate. The absolute second a client misses a legal milestone." The problem with shadow loans, Mother, is the restrictive covenants. I continued, pacing slowly behind Dominique's chair, deliberately letting the tension suffocate them all. "The contract you signed had a very specific, very aggressive liquidity clause hidden in the back pages. It stated clearly that the holding company you were purchasing with their money had to maintain a certain minimum baseline of viable revenue, generating intellectual property to justify the valuation. But as we just established, Dad transferred all of that intellectual property into a private Delaware trust 10 years ago. The second you officially signed those closing papers and purchased a completely hollow shell company, you instantly violated the core covenant of your massive loan. The asset you bought was essentially worthless, which triggered an immediate automatic default on your mortgage." Yvonne was gasping for air, her hands flying up to cover her mouth as the absolute reality of her total destruction crashed down upon her. She did not own the holding company, she did not own the software, and now she realized she had willingly surrendered the very roof over her head. I calmly reached down into the side pocket of my leather tote bag and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. The stack of legal documents inside represented the complete financial unmaking of Yvonne Sterling and her entire fake empire. I held the envelope in my hand for a brief moment, looking around the dining room at the terrified, broken people who had spent my entire life telling me I was worthless. I tossed the envelope casually onto the table right in the middle of the ruined fine china and the half-eaten, perfectly roasted turkey platter. "My firm bought your debt on Friday," I said, my voice echoing with absolute finality in the dead silence of the room. "You defaulted 48 hours ago." Yvonne stared at the thick manila envelope resting against the greasy rim of the turkey platter as if it were a live explosive device placed directly in the center of her perfect life. Her hands were trembling so violently that when she finally reached out to grab the heavy paper, her perfectly manicured fingernails scraped harshly against the expensive porcelain plate. She ripped the envelope open, tearing it to shreds in her desperate haste to pull out the documents and prove me wrong. Her dark eyes darted frantically back and forth across the crisp legal document, reading the bold black print at the very top of the page. "Notice of immediate default and foreclosure." She gasped loudly, her breath hitching painfully in her throat as she read the precise, ruthless terms she had blindly agreed to when she signed the shadow lending contract just a few days prior. The subprime lenders she had used did not play by traditional banking rules, which usually required months of gentle notices and generous grace periods. She had leveraged the entire estate under an aggressive immediate transfer clause to get the massive amount of cash she needed instantly. By violating the core intellectual property covenant regarding the worthless shell company she had purchased, the massive debt had instantly matured, and the physical property had immediately and legally transferred to the debt holder, which was my firm. "This cannot be legal." Yvonne choked out the crisp paper, shaking wildly in her grip as she crushed the edges in her fists. She looked up at me, her face completely drained of its usual arrogant color, her eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of absolute shock and pure panicked denial. "You cannot just take my home, Alana. I have lived here for 30 years. I am Yvonne Sterling. I built this legacy. You cannot legally evict me with a single piece of paper from some shadowy debt collection agency." "I did not evict you, Mother," I replied, keeping my voice completely level and devoid of any daughterly sympathy. "You evicted yourself the very moment you thought you were smart enough to outplay Dad from beyond the grave. You signed a highly predatory commercial contract without a competent corporate attorney present because you were far too arrogant to admit you did not understand the complex financial architecture of modern private equity. My firm simply acquired your terribly mismanaged high-risk debt on the open market. We are the legal owners of this estate as of Friday afternoon when the market closed. You have officially been trespassing on my private property for exactly 48 hours. The heavy, absolute finality of my words crashed down upon the ruined dining room like a physical weight. Dominique, who had been sitting frozen in her velvet chair, completely forgot about her desperate attempts to play the innocent, betrayed victim for the pastor. She dropped her hands from her tear-stained face entirely, her fake sobbing drying up the instant she realized the family wealth was officially and permanently gone. Her mouth hung open as she stared at the foreclosure notice trembling in our mother's rigid hands. The reality of her new poverty was setting in. "You lost the house!" Dominique shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical shrill whine that echoed painfully off the tall ceiling and crystal chandeliers. She leaped up from her chair, her expensive designer dress twisting around her legs as she pointed an accusing finger at our mother. "You mortgaged the family estate for absolutely nothing. Where are we supposed to live, Mother? How are we supposed to maintain our country club status if we do not even have a proper mailing address in this zip code?" Dominique was completely unhinged now. pacing frantically behind her chair and pulling aggressively at her perfect hair. She did not care that her husband was facing serious prison time or that her mother was entirely broken and humiliated. She only cared about her pristine social standing and the terrifying reality that she was about to become a homeless social pariah in the elite wealthy circles she worshipped so deeply. "Shut up, Dominique!" Yvonne snapped back, her voice cracking violently as she slammed the legal notice down onto the messy table. "I will call the governor. I will call the state Supreme Court justices. I play golf with every single weekend. I will tie this ridiculous fake document up in aggressive litigation for the next decade until your little firm is completely bankrupt, Alana." But Trent was not listening to Yvonne's delusional, desperate threats anymore. The former golden boy of the family, the arrogant venture capitalist who thought he could steal massive amounts of cash from the church and hide effortlessly behind his mother-in-law's immense wealth, was completely and utterly out of options. His eyes darted wildly around the dining room, searching for any possible exit strategy. He looked at the offshore routing numbers, still glowing brightly on the smart television screen, displaying his undeniable guilt for anyone to see. He looked at the empty space where the pastor had been standing just minutes ago before he walked out the front door to make a very important phone call. And finally, he looked at the foreclosure notice resting in the spilled red wine on the table, proving definitively that there was absolutely no money left in the Sterling Empire to bail him out of his crimes. The IRS would be aggressively freezing his accounts by Monday morning, and federal authorities would be kicking down his sleek office door before lunchtime. Trent let out a low, guttural sound of pure animal panic. He did not say a single comforting word to Dominique. He did not look at my mother to ask for help. He simply turned his sweaty body and lunged aggressively away from the dining table, his expensive leather shoes scrambling desperately for traction against the polished wood floor. He bumped roughly into the heavy doorway leading to the grand foyer, desperate to escape the devastating reality closing in around him. He was bolting for the front door, completely abandoning his crying wife and his ruined mother-in-law to save his own skin. He clearly thought if he could just make it outside to his car, he could drive away fast and disappear before the authorities arrived to ask questions about the missing $500,000 from the church community outreach fund. We could all hear his heavy, desperate footsteps pounding loudly across the marble tiles of the grand entryway. We heard him grab the heavy brass handle of the solid oak front door and yank it downward with all his panicked, terrified strength. Voice echoed through the mansion, mirroring the pounding of Dominique's desperate, panicked heartbeat. She shook her head frantically, her blonde hair falling out of its elegant updo and hanging in messy clumps across her face. "That is not true, Alana," she pleaded, taking another step back as I advanced. "I was just doing what Mom told me to do. You know how she is. You know she destroys anyone who disobeys her rules. I was terrified of what she would do to me if I helped you." "You were never terrified, Dominique," I replied, stepping right over a shattered crystal wine glass on the floor. "You were just incredibly greedy. You sold your soul and you sold your sister for country club memberships and designer handbags and spontaneous trips to the Caribbean. And now the bill has finally come due. The federal agents breaking down that door right now are going to seize your cars, your jewelry, your offshore accounts, and every single asset tied." But the heavy wooden door did not move a single inch. The loud mechanical clunk of the brass handle echoed down the long hallway, followed immediately by the frantic, pathetic sound of Trent pulling and shaking the immovable wood with all his might. "Open the door!" Trent yelled, his voice muffled and thick with rapidly rising hysteria. He began pounding his bare fists against the thick oak, the desperate sound reverberating through the silent mansion like a trapped animal fighting for its life. "Why is this locked? Open the damn door right now. Let me out of here." Yvonne stared down the hallway, completely bewildered by the sudden chaotic noise interrupting her moment of denial. She looked back at me, her dark eyes narrowing as she tried to comprehend why her own front door was refusing to open from the inside for her fleeing son-in-law. I reached into my suit pocket and casually pulled out my smartphone, resting it flat on the mahogany dining table right next to my crystal wine glass. The screen was brightly lit, displaying the proprietary administrative dashboard for the massive estate's highly advanced smart home security system. It was the very same comprehensive digital system I had designed, coded, and personally installed for Dad 7 years ago to protect his assets. A complex network that heavily relied on the central Delaware trust servers to function properly and process administrative overrides. You really should have completely changed the master administrative passwords when you threw me out of this house, Mother, I said, my voice perfectly calm and measured as Trent continued to violently throw his shoulder against the unyielding front door in the foyer. But then again, you never did understand how real technology actually works. I initiated a total architectural lockdown of the perimeter the exact moment the pastor walked out the front door. The reinforced steel deadbolts are completely engaged, and the entire property is electronically sealed from the outside in. No one is leaving this estate tonight. Trent let out a desperate screaming sob from the foyer, hitting the door weakly with his bruised fists as his options officially dropped to absolute zero. Dominique sank slowly back down into her velvet chair, staring at my glowing phone screen in absolute terrified silence, completely unable to process the fact that she was trapped. My mother looked like she could not breathe, her chest tightening painfully as the ultimate control she worshipped was effortlessly and permanently ripped from her grasping hands by the daughter she threw away, and then cutting cleanly through the heavy, suffocating silence of the dining room and Trent's pathetic, continuous sobbing in the hallway. We all heard it. The distinct, high-pitched wail of approaching police sirens cutting sharply through the quiet night air of the exclusive gated community. The flashing red and blue lights began to reflect faintly through the tall dining room windows, casting long, shifting shadows across my mother's horrified, defeated face. The pastor had not just walked away in disgust. He had walked straight to his car and called the federal authorities to report the massive embezzlement, and they were finally here. Dominique stared blankly at the crumpled retail job application fluttering to the floor, just as a series of sharp, heavy knocks violently shook the splintered front doors. The federal agents had clearly grown tired of waiting in the night air and were preparing to bring the rest of the thick oak down. Their booming voices echoed through the shattered glass, ordering everyone inside to remain exactly where they were. I did not even look at Dominique as she collapsed onto her knees beside the dining table, completely paralyzed by the reality of minimum wage labor. I calmly picked up my smartphone from the mahogany surface and tapped the screen once. The heavy digital deadbolts that had kept Trent imprisoned in the foyer retracted with a loud, simultaneous mechanical clack. The massive double doors swung open immediately, and the grand entryway was instantly flooded with a half-dozen federal agents and local police officers wearing tactical gear. The sheer, overwhelming presence of law enforcement completely shattered whatever fragile delusion Yvonne was still desperately clinging to. She stumbled backward away from the head of the table, her hands clutching her chest as if her heart were actually giving out. Trent was still huddled on the marble floor of the foyer, but the second the heavy black boots of the officers surrounded him, his pathetic whimpering instantly transformed back into the aggressive, entitled arrogance he had always used to bully his way through life. "Get your hands off me!" Trent screamed, thrashing wildly as two large officers grabbed him by the shoulders and hauled him forcefully to his feet. "Do you have any idea who I am? I am a senior partner at a major venture capital firm. You cannot just storm into this estate without a warrant. My mother-in-law is Yvonne Sterling. She plays golf with the governor. She will have every single one of your badges by tomorrow morning." The lead investigator, a tall, broad-shouldered man with an absolutely exhausted expression, completely ignored Trent's desperate elite name-dropping. "Trenton Blackwood." The investigator stated, his voice echoing flatly off the marble walls. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and federal tax evasion. You have the right to remain silent, which I highly suggest you use immediately." The cold, hard reality of the Miranda rights hitting his ears finally broke Trent's fake confidence. He looked wildly around the grand foyer, his eyes landing on my mother, who was standing frozen in the dining room archway, looking at him like he was a disgusting insect that had crawled out of the drain. In that exact moment, Trent realized that the Sterling family name was not going to be a magical shield to protect him from federal prison. He was completely cornered, and just like Dominique had done only minutes earlier, he immediately decided to drag his precious mother-in-law down into the flames right alongside him. "You are arresting the wrong person!" Trent yelled, his face turning a blotchy, frantic red as the officers forced his arms behind his back to apply the steel handcuffs. "I was just following her orders." He jerked his head aggressively toward Yvonne. "She is the one you want. She is the mastermind behind the entire financial conspiracy. She used my venture capital firm to illegally funnel money and hide her massive debt. She forced me to alter the church outreach funds to cover the second mortgage on this estate because she was completely broke. She is a fraud and a criminal." The absolute shock that rippled through Yvonne was so intense it actually made her stagger forward. The perfectly refined high society matriarch who had spent her entire adult life meticulously controlling her elite public image completely snapped. She did not care about the federal agents standing in her foyer. She did not care about the flashing police lights illuminating the street. She let out a guttural sound of pure, unfiltered rage and lunged across the foyer with terrifying speed. Before any of the officers could react, Yvonne raised her hand and delivered a vicious, resounding slap directly across Trent's face. The sharp crack echoed through the entire lower level of the mansion. "You pathetic lying parasite!" Yvonne screamed at the top of her lungs, completely abandoning any remaining shred of her country club composure. Her hair was falling out of its elegant style. Her face was twisted in an ugly, furious snarl, and she looked absolutely deranged. "I took you in. I gave you status. I gave you access to my world. And this is how you repay me. By dragging my pristine name through the mud with your sloppy amateur crimes." The officers immediately stepped between them, pushing the hysterical matriarch back toward the dining room. The lead investigator gave a sharp nod and the officers began dragging Trent forcefully toward the open front doors. Trent was actively fighting them, kicking his expensive Italian leather shoes against the marble and shouting more wild accusations about Yvonne's offshore tax evasions. As they dragged him out onto the grand front porch, the harsh reality of the neighborhood became agonizingly clear. The noise and the flashing lights had woken up the entire exclusive gated community. The wealthy neighbors, the country club board members, the elite judges and local politicians that Yvonne had spent 30 years desperately impressing were all standing on their manicured lawns or watching eagerly through their massive bay windows. They were witnessing the absolute ultimate humiliation of the Sterling family. They watched in hushed gossiping silence as the perfect golden white son-in-law was physically dragged down the stone steps in handcuffs, crying and screaming like a common criminal. The lead investigator turned his attention away from the spectacle outside and focused his exhausted gaze on Yvonne, who was still breathing heavily, her hand red from slapping Trent. "Mom, I am going to need everyone to clear the entryway," the investigator said, his tone carrying absolutely no respect for her social status. "We need to secure the premises and establish who actually has legal authority over this property." Yvonne stood up perfectly straight, desperately trying to smooth down her ruined silk jacket and reclaim her shattered authority. She raised her chin, attempting to look down her nose at the federal agent. "I have legal authority over this property," she stated, her voice dripping with venomous entitlement. "I am Yvonne Sterling and I own this estate. And I want you and your officers off my land this exact second before I call my personal attorneys and have you all completely destroyed." The investigator looked completely unimpressed by her aggressive posturing. He reached for his radio, ready to call for more backup, when I walked calmly out of the dining room, holding the thick stack of documents from the manila envelope. "Actually, officer," I said, stepping smoothly past my mother and handing the crisp legal paperwork directly to the lead investigator. Yvonne Sterling does not own this property anymore. My fintech firm officially acquired the defaulted mortgage on Friday afternoon, and this is the heavily expedited deed of ownership and the immediate notice of foreclosure that she just triggered. The investigator took the paperwork, his eyes scanning the bold legal print and the certified municipal stamps. He flipped to the second page, reviewing the aggressive shadow lending clauses that my mother had blindly signed. He nodded slowly, a look of complete understanding washing over his face as he realized exactly what had transpired. He looked up from the documents and turned his gaze back to my mother, who was standing there completely frozen in absolute horror as the final nail was driven securely into her coffin. "Well, Mrs. Sterling," the investigator said, folding the documents and handing them back to me, "it appears you do not have the authority to order anyone off this land. In fact, according to these legal filings, you no longer have the right to even be standing inside this building. You are currently legally trespassing on this young woman's private property, and I strongly suggest you start packing your bags before I am forced to arrest you too." The lead investigator turned on his heavy heel and marched straight out of the shattered front entryway, taking his officers with him and leaving a deafening heavy silence in his wake. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers slowly faded against the dining room walls as the federal vehicles backed out of the long cobblestone driveway, taking Trent and his ruined elite reputation away into the dark night. The massive luxury mansion, which had always felt so suffocatingly large and intimidating to me when I was a child, suddenly felt completely hollow and entirely dead. Dominique was still curled into a pathetic trembling ball on the floor near the mahogany dining table, weeping loudly into her hands as she loudly mourned the tragic death of her unlimited credit cards and her shallow high society standing. But my eyes were entirely fixed on Yvonne. The undisputed queen of the Sterling Empire was visibly crumbling right in front of me. The absolute finality of the federal agent's last words had pierced straight through decades of her thick, narcissistic armor. There were no more powerful state judges to call on her cell phone. There were no more country club board members to easily manipulate with fake smiles. There was no more stolen family wealth to hide her vile behavior behind. She was completely and utterly trapped in a cold new reality where she possessed zero power and zero assets. I watched as her dark eyes darted frantically around the lavish dining room, taking in the imported crystal chandeliers, the heavy silk curtains, and the priceless antique vases she had worshipped and protected far more than her own flesh and blood. It was exactly as if she was standing over her own open grave, watching her entire life being buried. Her breath began to hitch painfully in her throat, coming out in these rapid, shallow gasps that sounded exactly like a dying machine. The perfectly refined high society posture that she used to deeply intimidate everyone around her just completely and totally collapsed. Her sharp shoulders slumped forward, her knees violently buckled, and the great Yvonne Sterling sank heavily down onto the stained oriental rug right next to her sobbing golden child. But she did not reach out to comfort Dominique. Instead, she turned her desperate, panicked gaze slowly up toward me. The woman who had spent my entire life looking down her perfect nose at me was now literally groveling at my feet. She scrambled forward across the hardwood floor, her expensive designer skirt catching and tearing on the shattered glass of the broken wine goblets. She reached out with trembling, desperate hands and aggressively grabbed the hem of my tailored dress, her fingers clutching the expensive fabric like a drowning sailor, desperately clinging to a tiny life raft in the middle of a hurricane. "Alana, my baby!" she sobbed, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine that made my skin crawl with absolute disgust. "You cannot do this to me. You cannot throw me out into the street like common trash. I gave you life. I am your mother." "Blood is thicker than water, Alana. Please, you have to listen to me right now. We can fix this terrible mess. We can run the company together, just you and me as partners. You are so incredibly brilliant, and I have all the elite social connections in this city. We can rebuild the Sterling Empire from the ground up, and it will be completely ours. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the top of her messy blonde hair and the desperate white-knuckled grip she maintained on my clothes. The sheer arrogant audacity of her words, the sudden manipulative pivot to calling me her sweet baby after treating me like an infectious disease for over 30 years, was so intensely revolting it almost took my breath away. She was actually trying to weaponize the basic biological fact of my birth to save her own skin, right after she had spent my entire adult existence actively trying to destroy my spirit and my financial independence. My mind instantly flashed back to a freezing cold, sterile hospital room exactly 4 years ago. I had been rushed to the intensive care unit in the middle of the night with a severe systemic infection, my major organs rapidly shutting down as my weak body fought a terrifying losing battle. The emergency room doctors had called my listed emergency contacts repeatedly, telling my family that I was in critical condition and might not make it through the weekend. Dominique had simply ignored the urgent voicemails because she was enjoying a luxury spiritual retreat in the mountains. But Yvonne had actually answered the phone on the third try. The hospital nursing staff later told me that when they carefully explained I was sedated on a ventilator actively fighting for my life, my mother had coldly replied that it was incredibly inconvenient timing because she was currently hosting the massive annual charity gala at her country club, and she simply could not leave her important wealthy guests. She had knowingly abandoned me in the ICU to potentially die completely alone, while she drank vintage champagne, wore a custom designer gown, and smiled brightly for the local society photographers. She did not care if I drew my absolute last breath in that hospital bed as long as my death did not awkwardly interrupt her prestigious social calendar. And now she was on her bruised knees on the dining room floor begging for my financial mercy, based purely on the sacred imaginary bond of motherhood. I did not pull away from her desperate grasp immediately. I let her hold on to the hem of my dress, letting her fully feel the absolute futility of her pathetic grip. I looked down at her tear-stained, perfectly lifted face, and I felt absolutely nothing at all. No anger, no residual sadness, no lingering pathetic childhood desire for her maternal approval. The space in my chest where a loving daughter's heart should have been was just a cold, solid, impenetrable wall of total indifference. Blood is just biology. Yvonne, I said, my voice perfectly flat and completely devoid of any emotion, effortlessly cutting through her hysterical sobbing like a surgical steel blade. Loyalty is a choice. She froze completely, her dark, wet eyes looking up at me wide and terrified as the freezing cold reality of my final words washed entirely over her. You permanently lost the right to call yourself my mother. The exact night you left me to die on a breathing machine so you could comfortably attend a golf club dinner party, I continued, my tone deadly and absolute. You lost the right to talk about blood and family loyalty when you happily watched Dominique and Trent steal my dead father's hard-earned legacy to fund their pathetic, shallow lives. You freely chose your precious social standing. You chose your expensive designer labels and your toxic country club gossip. You chose greed and absolute power over the life of your own child. And now you have absolutely none of those things left to protect you. I reached down calmly and gripped her shaking wrists, digging my thumbs painfully deep into her pulse points until she gasped loudly and released her tight grip on my dress. I stepped backward, putting necessary physical and emotional distance between us forever. There is no wealthy company for us to run together, I told her, looking down at the broken, ruined woman sobbing on the floor. The Sterling Empire is permanently dead. My firm owns the massive debt. My firm owns the frozen assets, and I legally own this house. You have exactly 1 hour to pack whatever cheap personal belongings the federal agents decide not to seize for evidence. If you are still standing anywhere on my private property when the clock strikes midnight, I will personally drag you out to the street curb by your hair and call the local police to arrest you for criminal trespassing. Yvonne stared blindly up at me, her mouth opening and closing repeatedly, but no actual sound coming out. The crushing realization that her ultimate manipulation had completely failed, that her fake motherly tears meant absolutely nothing to me, finally broke her fragile mind. She slumped forward heavily onto the stained rug, burying her face deep in her hands and letting out a long, hollow wail of pure, agonizing defeat that echoed off the high ceilings. Dominique was still crying weakly in the corner, rocking back and forth as the terrifying reality of her new minimum wage future loomed directly ahead. I turned my back on both of them, leaving them to drown completely in the ruined ashes of the fake empire they had murdered my father to protect. I walked out of the destroyed dining room, my heels clicking sharply and powerfully against the marble floor of the grand foyer, the satisfying sound echoing beautifully through my new house. I was already halfway across the grand foyer, walking purposefully toward the massive shattered front doors, when I heard the frantic scrambling behind me. My heels were clicking sharply against the cold marble tiles, but even that satisfying sound could not mask the pathetic noise of Yvonne dragging herself out of the dining room. She simply could not accept defeat. Her deeply toxic narcissism absolutely refused to let me have the final word in a house she still desperately believed belonged to her. Her expensive silk designer skirt caught on the jagged edge of the wooden doorframe, tearing loudly and leaving a long, ruined strip of fabric behind her as she stumbled out into the hallway. "Alana!" She screeched, her voice echoing violently off the high, vaulted ceiling. "You owe me! You owe me everything! You would be absolutely nothing in this world without the sterling name. I made you. You cannot just walk away from me and leave me here like this." I stopped walking. The heavy silence of the foyer was broken only by the sound of my slow, deliberate footsteps as I turned around and walked right back toward her. She was sprawled awkwardly across the cold floor, looking up at me with a sickening mixture of absolute hatred and pathetic desperation. Outside the grand windows, the federal agents were already busy cataloging the luxury vehicles in the driveway, completely ignoring the ruined matriarch bleeding out her false dignity on her own floor. A new group of professionals had just stepped through the broken doorway behind me, carrying heavy metal clipboards and thick sheets of bright neon green stickers. The foreclosure agents. My agents. They stood silently waiting for my final command to begin dismantling the Sterling Empire piece by piece. I did not say a single word as I closed the distance between us. The air in the foyer was thick and suffocating, but I felt entirely clear-headed and perfectly calm. I crouched down gracefully, my tailored skirt brushing lightly against the marble, and leaned in close. I brought my face just inches from hers, forcing her to look directly into my eyes. The heavy scent of her expensive signature perfume was completely soured by the sharp metallic smell of her rising panic and deep sweat. She stopped screaming instantly, her breath catching painfully in her throat as she stared into the cold, dead void where my daughterly affection used to live. She expected to find some lingering shred of sympathy, some small crack in my armor that she could easily exploit, but there was absolutely nothing left for her to take. "You want to talk about what we owe each other, Mother?" I whispered, my voice so soft and venomous, it made her physically flinch backward. "Let us take a quick little trip down memory lane right now. Let us go back exactly 10 years. I was 22 years old, and I was lying in a cheap public hospital bed on the other side of town. My right lung had completely collapsed. I was suffocating violently, struggling to draw a single agonizing breath, while the emergency room doctors frantically tried to insert a thick plastic chest tube to keep me alive. I was absolutely terrified. I thought I was going to die right there in that awful, sterile, brightly lit room. The nursing staff called you repeatedly because you were still legally listed as my primary emergency contact. They begged you to come down to the hospital immediately to sign the surgical consent forms and just be there for your youngest daughter who was actively fighting for her life. I kept my eyes locked onto hers, watching the blood completely drain from her perfectly lifted and contoured face as she realized exactly which specific memory I was unearthing. I remember hearing your voice clearly on the speakerphone at the main nurse's station. I continued, my words falling like heavy, crushing stones upon her chest. "Do you remember what you said to the doctors when my lung collapsed? Do you remember the exact words you used when they told you that I desperately needed emergency surgery to survive the night? Yvonne tried to look away, but I reached out and grabbed her chin tightly, forcing her to maintain strict eye contact with me. You let out an annoyed little sigh, I said, perfectly mimicking her exact dismissive tone from that horrible night. And then you told that exhausted, terrified trauma doctor I am not staying just to deal with paperwork. I have a VIP party at Martha's Vineyard. And then you hung up the phone. You did not even ask if I was stable or if my heart was still beating. You did not ask if the invasive surgery was risky. You just hung up the phone, packed your matched designer luggage, and flew off to a miserable elite island to drink vintage wine with hollow people who do not even like you. While I woke up completely alone, cut open, bruised, and strapped to a breathing machine, you were busy posing for society photographs on a yacht. I watched the horrific realization wash entirely over her as the ghosts of her own monstrous cruelty finally came back to haunt her in her darkest hour. She tried to open her mouth to make a pathetic excuse to offer some twisted high society justification for abandoning her sick child in a trauma ward. But her voice completely failed her. She just stared at me, her lips trembling violently, her dark eyes wide with the crushing, suffocating weight of her absolute failure as a mother and as a human being. She had built her entire life on the premise that she was untouchable and superior, but right now she was nothing more than a frightened hollow shell of a woman. Blood is just biology. Yvonne, I said, my voice perfectly flat and completely devoid of any emotion, effortlessly cutting through the suffocating silence of the foyer. Loyalty is a choice. I released her chin, letting her head slump forward in total defeat as I stood up tall and completely straightened my posture, smoothing out my jacket. The massive crystal chandelier above us cast a brilliant warm light down onto my wrist. I slowly and deliberately lifted my arm and adjusted the heavy, solid gold Rolex, resting perfectly against my skin. I checked the time, tapping the expensive crystal face once with my fingernail, the sharp click echoing in the quiet space. "Well, Mother," I said, my voice bright and casually dismissive, completely mimicking the exact careless tone she had used on the phone all those years ago. "I have a flight to catch to Martha's Vineyard. My private equity firm is throwing a massive victory celebration on the island for this very successful corporate acquisition. I strongly suggest you finish packing your paperwork." I did not give her a single second to respond or formulate another manipulative plea. I simply turned on my heel and walked straight toward the shattered front doors, stepping effortlessly over the splintered oak wood and broken security glass. Behind me, the team of foreclosure agents immediately went to professional work. They moved past Yvonne like she was completely invisible, slapping bright neon green inventory stickers onto the priceless antique console tables, the imported silk sitting chairs, and the massive grandfather clock ticking loudly in the hallway. Yvonne realized that every single thing she had ever loved or valued was being legally tagged and permanently ripped away from her grasping hands. She collapsed fully onto her stomach, pounding her bare fists aggressively against the cold marble floor and letting out a ragged, piercing scream of pure, agonizing despair that chased me all the way out into the cool, refreshing night air. I walked down the long cobblestone driveway toward my waiting black town car, leaving the completely ruined Sterling Empire entirely behind me, and I never looked back once. The next 6 months moved with a ruthless, brutal efficiency that finally brought absolute justice to the Sterling family name. The rapid, complete dismantling of their fraudulent lives played out exactly like a highly publicized, tragic play. And I watched every single second of it from the comfortable distance of my top-floor corner office. The federal authorities moved with incredible speed, tearing through decades of financial lies and exposing the absolute rot at the very core of my mother's empire. Trent's highly anticipated federal trial was an absolute media circus from the very first day. The arrogant venture capitalist who used to brag about his untouchable political connections spent 3 grueling weeks sitting at the defense table, looking pale, sweaty, and completely defeated. The federal prosecutors did not hold back a single piece of evidence. They meticulously displayed the offshore routing numbers, the forged church outreach documents, and the aggressive second mortgages right on the massive courtroom monitors for the entire jury to see. His expensive defense attorneys tried to spin a narrative that he was simply confused by complex accounting errors, but the paper trail was completely undeniable. Trent actually broke down and sobbed loudly on the witness stand, throwing away any remaining shred of his masculine pride. He spent 4 hours blaming his entire financial conspiracy on his domineering mother-in-law, begging the judge for mercy because he was allegedly manipulated. But the federal judge remained completely unmoved by his pathetic theatrical tears. Trenton Blackwood was officially convicted of multiple counts of felony wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and massive federal tax evasion. He was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, instantly trading his bespoke Italian suits for an abrasive orange jumpsuit and a tiny concrete cell where his sterling connections meant absolutely nothing. Dominique's spectacular fall from high society. Grace was even faster and much more brutal than her husband's trial. The very second the embezzlement scandal hit the local news, her elite circle of incredibly shallow friends dropped her with absolutely zero hesitation. Women who used to kiss her cheek at charity galas and drink imported champagne on her yacht suddenly acted like they had never even met her. Her daily phone calls went straight to voicemail, and her desperate text messages pleading for temporary loans were completely ignored. Her exclusive country club membership was immediately and permanently revoked due to unpaid monthly dues and the moral turpitude clause. With her assets completely frozen and her husband locked behind bars, my beautiful golden sister was violently forced into the brutal reality of the working class she had always mocked. She was evicted from her luxury condo and had to move into a tiny studio apartment. Dominique now spends 40 grueling hours a week standing on her feet under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights of a mid-tier suburban shopping mall. She works the perfume and cosmetics counter wearing a cheap, scratchy polyester uniform and a fake plastic name tag that she hates. The ultimate humiliation came when her former country club friends actually walked past her counter pointing and laughing behind their hands while she was forced to smile and offer them free samples of cheap cologne. Her soft hands are now calloused from washing makeup brushes, and her pristine blonde hair is showing dark, unkempt roots because she can no longer afford her elite salon appointments. The golden child is officially a nobody. But the absolute most poetic justice belonged entirely to Yvonne. The undisputed queen of the local elite was violently exiled from her pristine luxury bubble and forced into a cramped, noisy one-bedroom apartment in a highly undesirable neighborhood on the south side of the city. The walls of her new home are covered in peeling yellow wallpaper, and the constant wail of police sirens keeps her awake all night long. The smell of cheap, stale cooking oil constantly seeps through the thin walls from the neighboring units. She no longer has a massive formal dining room to host her manipulative power dinners. She barely has a functioning kitchen with a stove that only works half the time. The elite church board completely excommunicated her, removing her name from every single brass donor plaque and formally banning her from stepping foot inside the sanctuary. Her prestigious college sorority alumni chapter held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to strip her of her lifetime membership status, citing the massive public humiliation she brought to their pristine organization. Yvonne spends her days sitting alone on a cheap, worn-out sofa, staring blankly at a small television screen, completely isolated, bitter, and totally alone. Her empire is dust, and her name is a local joke. But narcissistic entitlement is an incredibly difficult disease to cure. Yvonne simply could not accept that her era of supreme power was completely over and that she was no longer relevant. Exactly 6 months after I walked out of that shattered mansion, my personal assistant buzzed my office line with a very frantic, confused tone. I was sitting at my sleek glass desk reviewing a highly profitable quarterly report when I heard the sudden chaotic commotion echoing out in the main reception area. Yvonne had somehow managed to follow a delivery worker through the secure lobby doors of my downtown corporate headquarters, entirely bypassing the ground floor security desk. She was stomping aggressively across the polished marble floor of the reception area, wearing an outdated faded designer coat and loudly demanding to be led into the executive suites. She completely ignored the alarmed security guards who were rapidly approaching her, grabbing the heavy glass doors of my private office suite and rattling them violently. "Open this door right now!" she shrieked, her shrill, desperate voice completely shattering the quiet professional atmosphere of the entire executive floor. "I demand an audience with the chief executive officer right this instant. I need an emergency monthly allowance established immediately. Tell these stupid security guards to get their hands off my coat. I am Yvonne Sterling and I demand to see my daughter." I sat perfectly still in my high-backed leather chair, staring at the live, high-definition security feed playing across my sleek computer monitor. The walls of my penthouse executive office were made of solid, soundproof glass, offering a breathtaking panoramic view of the downtown skyline. But my absolute entire focus was zeroed in on the pathetic scene unfolding 30 floors below me in the grand lobby. The pristine white marble floors and the minimalist modern art of my corporate headquarters provided a harsh, unforgiving backdrop for Yvonne's complete and total public meltdown. She looked absolutely feral. The expensive tailored coats she used to wear like royal armor had been replaced by a faded, wrinkled jacket that hung awkwardly on her shrinking frame. Her signature blonde hair, which she used to spend thousands of dollars a week maintaining, was completely unkempt and pulled back with a cheap plastic clip. She was actively thrashing against the broad shoulders of my two head security guards, her worn-out shoes slipping on the polished marble as she tried desperately to force her way toward the private executive elevators. My desk phone buzzed sharply, cutting through the absolute quiet of my sanctuary. I tapped the flashing button, and the frantic, trembling voice of my young front desk receptionist filled the room. "Mrs. Sterling, I am so incredibly sorry to disturb you," the receptionist said, her voice shaking with adrenaline. "There is an extremely aggressive woman down here causing a massive disturbance. She is screaming that she is your mother and that she has a legal right to demand a monthly allowance from your accounts. The local police have already been notified, but she is refusing to leave the building peacefully." I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the cool, smooth glass of my desk. I looked at the monitor, watching Yvonne point a shaking, bony finger directly at the security camera, screaming my name over and over again with a wide, desperate mouth. She was begging for scraps from the very same daughter she had happily left to die on a ventilator. She wanted to leech off the massive financial empire she had actively tried to destroy. I felt absolutely no anger anymore. The burning rage that had fueled my silent $20 million corporate takeover had completely burned itself out, leaving behind a vast, cool ocean of absolute clarity. I reached out and pressed the silver intercom button on my console. My voice carried smoothly down through the building speakers, filling the massive lobby with cold, detached authority. "I do not know that woman," I said, simply staring directly into the camera feed. "Escort her off the premises immediately and permanently ban her from the property." I watched on the glowing screen as the thick, heavy glass doors of the lobby swung open. My security team grabbed Yvonne firmly by the arms, completely ignoring her wild shrieks and pathetic thrashing. They hauled her forcefully out of the pristine lobby and practically threw her out onto the hot, busy concrete sidewalk. She stumbled and fell, landing hard on her hands and knees in front of dozens of staring pedestrians and corporate employees. She looked back up at the towering glass skyscraper, the physical manifestation of my ultimate victory, and finally realized she would never be allowed inside again. I quietly shut off the security monitor, returning my office to total perfect silence. The Sterling toxic legacy was officially and permanently dead. The harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights and the claustrophobic concrete city streets melted away completely, replaced by the brilliant, blinding warmth of the afternoon sun. The air smelled richly of sweet salt and blooming hibiscus. I was walking slowly barefoot along the edge of a stunning, sun-drenched private beach. The soft white sand squeezed gently between my toes with every single step, grounding me entirely in the peaceful present moment. The rhythmic crashing of the crystal-clear ocean waves created a beautiful, calming soundtrack that completely washed away any lingering dark echoes of my past. I was not walking alone. Beside me, walking with a slow, steady grace that absolutely defied her age, was my grandmother Estelle. The oppressive, suffocating environment of Yvonne's toxic mansion had nearly drained the life completely out of her. But ever since I had moved her into my private coastal estate, she had undergone a miraculous revival. The gray pallor of stress and constant emotional abuse had completely vanished from her soft face, replaced by a healthy, warm, radiant glow. She was wearing a light, flowing linen dress that caught the gentle ocean breeze, and her silver hair shone brilliantly in the bright sunlight. She looked genuinely happy, completely safe, and entirely at peace for the first time in decades. She reached out and gently looped her arm through mine, her warm hand resting affectionately against my wrist. We walked together in comfortable silence for a long time, simply watching the white seagulls dive and soar above the sparkling turquoise water. There was no need for the constant exhausting defensive posturing that had defined our entire lives under Yvonne's vicious rule. There were no harsh judgments, no cruel comparisons, and absolutely no hidden manipulative agendas. Estelle stopped walking and turned to face me. She reached up and gently touched my cheek, her eyes swimming with a mixture of profound relief and overwhelming pride. "You know your father would be so incredibly proud of the empire you built, Alana," she said, her voice soft but filled with absolute conviction. "Not just because of the massive financial success, and not just because you successfully reclaimed the legacy that was brutally stolen from him. He would be proud of the remarkable woman you became through all that terrible suffering. You faced absolute monsters and you never once let them turn you into one." I looked down at my grandmother, feeling a warm, powerful surge of genuine love fill my chest. It was a clean, pure love, completely free from the toxic obligations and the conditional approval that had poisoned my childhood. I turned my gaze away from her soft, smiling face and looked out toward the endless, sprawling horizon. The ocean was vast and powerful, moving with an unstoppable natural momentum that no human could ever hope to control or manipulate. It was the absolute stark opposite of the dark, suffocating, formal dining room where Yvonne and Trent had tried to permanently end my life. I took a deep, cleansing breath, letting the fresh, salty ocean air fill my healthy, completely healed lungs. I thought about the long, agonizing journey from that terrifying hospital bed to this beautiful, sunlit shore. I thought about the relentless, quiet ambition that had kept me alive when everyone else had completely written me off. "They tried to bury me in the dark, Grandma," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the sound of the crashing waves, ringing with absolute finality and total peace. "They did not know I was a seed." I put my arm around her frail shoulders, and we turned to face the brilliant, endless expanse of the ocean. The golden sun sparkled brilliantly across the pristine white sand, illuminating the boundless, glorious future that finally belonged entirely to me, without any interruptions or dark shadows to hold me back.